The role of climate change in Wednesday's disaster in Nepal is under scrutiny by scientists trying to find out what caused the catastrophe. And elsewhere, countries around the world have been hit by extreme weather events. So what lessons can be learned from this Nepal disaster and others this year? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. A disaster that unfolded in minutes in Nepal and China's autonomous region of Tibet, with hundreds of people dead and hundreds more missing. And Chinese and Nepalese investigations believe that a high-altitude glacier collapse triggered the disaster. Floodwater with rock and ice then surged through the valleys below, destroying everything in their path. Estimates say that it traveled 22 kilometers in just 7 minutes, an astonishing speed of nearly 200 kilometers an hour. The cause of the glacier collapse is still under investigation, as is any link to climate change. But elsewhere, record temperatures this year have hit parts of Asia and Europe. Severe storms have occurred in Asia, the US, and Canada too. Africa has seen floods, drought, and wildfires, as have Europe and North America. So, what lessons can be learned from the Nepal disaster and from this year's extreme climate events around the world? We'll be speaking to our guests shortly. First, though, this report from Wilson Dysart.
The Himalayan mountains are sometimes called the roof of the world. This is what it looks like when that roof falls down. Hundreds of people are dead and hundreds more are missing after a glacier at the border between Nepal and China collapsed on Wednesday. It sent a wall of water 3,000 meters down through populated mountain valleys at 200 kilometers an hour.
All I want is that my husband comes back to me safely in one piece. I do not want anything else.
Rescuers from across the region have come to help find survivors. Those who have survived may not have homes to return to, with the glacier collapse burying villages under mud and debris. The worst hit part of Nepal is the Rasuwa district, north of its capital, Kathmandu. But the consequences of the disaster are still being assessed.
Almost 4 districts, they have been cut off from the mainland. All the bridges have been washed away. And because of the high velocity of flooding, it's like a flash flood, so people could not protect themselves. And there are lots of casualties. The exact situation is yet to be known.
After fears of further flooding, some rescue efforts on Friday were temporarily paused and then resumed. Nepal is one of the poorest countries in the world and will require outside help to recover.
Let me begin with a word about the horrifying flooding in Nepal and China. I extend my deepest condolences to families of the victims and express my solidarity with all those affected. The United Nations is mobilizing supplies and humanitarian teams, and we pledge to support national efforts to deliver emergency aid and support.
Scientists are working to find out the exact cause of the disaster and any link to climate change. Rising temperatures have been blamed for the retreat of glaciers elsewhere in the world. This year has seen historically high temperatures across Europe, leading to at least 35,000 excess deaths from heat, especially among the elderly. Those temperatures have caused wildfires in southern Europe and even Belgium, where firefighters battled the flames for weeks this summer. Just in the first half of 2026 alone, the United States saw 12 natural disasters, mostly storms, causing more than $30 billion in damage. And climate scientists are warning that a periodic warming of the eastern Pacific Ocean caused by the El Niño climate pattern will be intense this year, and the cause of even more severe weather worldwide. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Time to bring in our guests. In Bhutan's capital, Thimphu, Pema Gyamtsho, Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. That's a Nepal-based intergovernmental knowledge and learning center. In Hong Kong, Benjamin Horton, Dean of the School of Energy and Environment and Professor of Earth Science at City University of Hong Kong. You've been awarded the 2026 Axford Medal. That's the highest honor given to a climate scientist in Asia. And in the French city of Marseille, Wolfgang Cramer, an Emeritus research professor at the National Center for Scientific Research. A warm welcome to all of you. Mr. Pema Gyamtsho, you're in Bhutan. The organization that you head studies what happens in the Hindu Kush/Himalaya region. So you and your teams, I understand, are actively looking at this Nepal disaster. I know that firm conclusions can't yet be fully drawn, but with the information you have now, what caused the flash flooding in Nepal?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Yes, as you rightly said, my colleagues are in the field, also helping the government of Nepal and the agencies involved in investigating what actually caused this disaster. And as you rightly pointed out, this was a kind of disaster that we have never witnessed before. It was literally a tsunami from the sky. So from what we know as of now is, as you said, is a glacial collapse, that triggered this massive, the flooding, and the impact, as you have seen, is enormous. So still the investigations are in progress, and I do not want to preempt, any conclusive, findings from the studies that are going on. But, it just shows that in this kind of mountainous terrain in the Himalayas, where warming is taking place twice above the global average, is very unpredictable. This kind of events are very unpredictable, and this is going to happen. And there is very little time for even issuing warning. Forget about, being more prepared and, responding to this, catastrophic disaster. So all I want to say at this stage is that the studies are still ongoing, and we'll be able to provide more information as we go on.
So currently, the belief that is widely shared is that a glacial collapse caused this flash floods. How does a glacial collapse happen? We're talking about a huge chunk, possibly hundreds of meters wide, of glaciers just coming loose. How does that happen?
Well, I would believe that it's a combination of the softening of the ice and the melting that is taking place, and that brought along with it the huge piece of rock, and the combination of the debris from the rock and the ice, falling so many meters, thousands of meters down into the river, and into the tributary of one of the rivers called Botikhoshi, and then the Botikhoshi again linking up with another, the main river called Trishuli. So, and then, what has actually, even sort of made the disaster worst is the narrow valley. So the river has nowhere to go, the water has nowhere to go except go along this narrow valley, and then it reached the lower areas so fast. I think in a matter of minutes, 15, 16 minutes, it has reached downstream and affected, the towns and settlements, the infrastructure down there. So I think that is what we are hearing at this stage.
Wolfgang Cramer, does global warming make events like this more likely?
Yeah, that is exactly the good question. And the IPCC has looked at this in depth by synthesizing the literature about the relationship between damages and climate change over the entire planet. And what we have found is that there is an increase in the likelihood of such events. It's very important to be clear, as my colleague has already been, to not say that this particular event automatically has been caused by climate change only. There are always multiple factors coming together, and we need to look very carefully at the data as they come in. But what is clear is that the IPCC and many scientists and many institutions have been warning for an increased risk for such events over many decades. And while we can learn more from this in terms of protecting people when these events happen, we also must not forget that we need to actually lower and avoid the emissions of greenhouse gases that ultimately are at the cause of this. And as your introduction very rightly showed, there are many other extreme events around the world that are also killing people and causing economic losses that are in similar consequences of our failed climate policies.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. We'll get also to the heat waves that took place and have been taking place recently in your neck of the woods in Europe. 5 heat waves this summer, all of this being connected, of course. I want to be very clear, and I'll echo what both speakers have said so far, what we're saying and what we're not saying. We, as journalistically, certainly cannot establish a direct link right now between global warming and the floods in Nepal. But Benjamin Horton, there is actually a branch of science that does this. It's a little early for attribution science to give a verdict on the Nepal flash floods, but there is a branch of science that looks at specific weather events and that actually quantifies how likely it is that global warming has contributed. Can you be our attribution science professor for just a minute and explain to viewers what that is and how you study that?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I would like to offer my thoughts to my colleague in Kathmandu and wish him and his team all the success in making the region resilient and recover quickly from this devastating disaster. I would be a bit more forthright about linking this disaster to climate change. We have been pumping greenhouse gases predominantly from the fossil fuel industry for decades now, and that's increased global temperatures. But the temperatures in the Himalayan plateau are increasing twice the global average. When you increase temperature, what happens to the Himalayan ice cap? It melts. The rate of melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas has doubled over the last 10 years. They have lost 12% of their surface area. If we don't do anything about climate change, it's projected within the next 25 to 50 years that we'll lose 70 to 80% of these glaciers. So when you melt glaciers, they're not going to melt in a gradual manner. They're going to have these huge events like nuclear explosions going off in these very, very exposed and vulnerable areas. Yes, you can't pin down one individual event, but just connect the dots. You increase greenhouse gases, you increase temperatures, you melt ice, and it causes disasters like this. So going back to your question about attribution, basically what you ask is, how probable would this event have occurred with or without human-induced climate change? And what we find again and again with this most extreme types of disasters, be it this flood and debris landslide or your heat waves, is that they were virtually impossible without climate change.
Pema, Gyamtsho, back to you. Benjamin Horton has made the point that, and you made the point actually first as well, that global warming is actually happening faster at high altitude and specifically in the Himalayas than it is anywhere else in the planet. And Benjamin made the point that that means we can expect more extreme events, including melting of glaciers in the Himalayas. And that can impact China, that can impact Nepal. It's at least 8 countries that are impacted: India, Afghanistan, Pakistan. What do you see, what do you foresee in the near term and medium term for countries along the Himalayas?
Yes, I think the reality is that we are going to have more and more of such events. The glaciers are, as you rightly pointed out, is already rightly pointed out by the other speakers, is melting at an unprecedented rates. And across the Hindu Kush Himalayas, we have something like 54,000 glaciers and very few monitoring stations. So we need to now enhance our capacity for monitoring what is happening to the glaciers, the glacier lakes, and also assess the risk better, the potential, the risk of the glacier lake outburst floods and so on. So here we need to work together. The upstream countries, downstream countries need to work together, strengthen the capacity of the disaster management authority, the scientific capacity of institutions doing the assessments, and also enable the exchange of information in real time, and better prediction to better early warning system, and of course better
But Mr.
preparedness.
Gyamtsho, would that
I
have
think
worked? Would that have
yes.
worked in this particular case? It was so massive. I mean, what we understand from the monitoring stations, and I read this, by the way, on your website, so you know this better than I do. But what I understand is that the level of water along the rivers rose within moments, right? Over about 20, 30 minutes, rose by about 10 meters. And that means a wall of mud and rock and silt and sediment of about 10 meters just rushed down the mountain. And you can't outrun that. You can't outdrive it. Would early warning and better monitoring have actually changed anything?
Well, in this case, as you rightly pointed out, the time was so short. So, and then it was also very difficult to predict such an event. But, we are going to have different kinds of, these kind of outburst floods, flash floods, and so on. But to reduce the impact, because in the Himalayas, unlike in the North Pole or the South Pole, here we have millions of people living very close to, these potential glacial lake outburst floods and so on. So very near, close to avalanches and so on. So downstream, I think we need to be better prepared. We need to have better evacuation plans, disaster management plans, and also, to the extent possible now, we have to learn from this lesson, from this event, and try to avoid building settlements, infrastructure, close to the river or along the river banks. So we can, take adaptation measures, building climate resilience, and of course, better communication between communities and between organizations, institutions. And that means we need to pump in quite a lot of resources to be able to do that.
Wolfgang Cramer, so you're in Marseille, in France. I'm going to jump from one extreme weather event to another, right? We said at the top of the show, 5 heat waves in France, wildfires, droughts. The French farmers have suffered agricultural losses, water restrictions in France. There are also other countries I could have mentioned, Greece, Belgium, and others. You're on the other side of the world from where Mr. Gyamtsho is. How do you connect those dots of completely different types of extreme weather events, but that are nonetheless affecting communities around the world?
Yeah, well, to a degree, this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, was created to do, indeed, to connect the dots and to give a global picture of consequences of climate change and also projections of climate change impacts. This has been advancing quite rapidly over the last few years with more systematic studies worldwide. But you are right to point out that in every single case, there are both the general population and also the scientists who are hit by the specific event and who are asking themselves, what could we have done to avoid this? And I agree that it could have been. It is a general pattern that we can, with some monitoring, we can reduce in many different cases around the world the risks. And Switzerland, for example, with a very devastating debris flow last year, has been able to protect the downstream villages. This was, of course, much smaller than the Nepal China case, but what we need to do, and really we cannot stop doing it, is to tell the world that if we continue greenhouse gas emissions at the rates that we are currently doing, then we will not escape from bigger and bigger disasters of this kind. We cannot monitor ourselves out of this, and we cannot build protective structures around everyone and every economic sector. We need to have a radical change in climate policies at this point, and if we don't, then we will have. We have had 35,000 deaths in Europe alone attributed over the last few weeks to the heat waves that you've mentioned. That's a huge number that is probably going to escape from the public attention in a few weeks. But we must tell our governments and our decision makers that current climate policies are directly liable for this kind of suffering and economic losses. And if we do not change, then there are going to be more and various more extreme events of various kinds around the world. And I find this personally a very, very sad and difficult message to insist upon.
Benjamin Horton, it's 11 years ago, the world agreed in the Paris Climate Accord to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Can we still hit that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark?
In 2024, we crossed that threshold.
Yep.
So the Paris Agreement was initially made by scientists. Scientists were asked a question: how much should we warm the world? Beyond which you risk the places that we live, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, and the air that we breathe. And the scientific community came together and said, we need to limit our global warming to being 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial. But in 2024, we went above it, and we've stayed above it. And every single year, as we pump out more and more carbon dioxide, we go above that limit. And that is an existential crisis. And the disasters that we see in Europe, in North America, in the Himalayas, are the result of crossing that threshold. So, climate change is incredibly complex to predict where and when and how intense a disaster is. But there are some elements that are so very, very simple. You increase carbon dioxide, that increases global temperatures, and we know this threshold. So then what's the solution? The solution is therefore very, very simple. Reduce your reliance on carbon dioxide. Start to think about protecting your ecosystems, absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, develop and enhance at scale technologies to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We know the problem, we know the solutions, we just need to act on them. Because if we don't, you'll keep on asking scientists to these shows to try and explain the problem. And what you find is that you get scientists in the regions who are very, very emotional about what's happening to their communities. You get scientists like myself who get incredibly frustrated because we've been talking about this for decades now. The models of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that were developed in the 1990s are laser focused. They've predicted every single outcome. We have to just simply respond now.
If current trends...
And one of the things I would just say about in the Himalayas, how horrific it is that for a country of Nepal that contributed less than 0.02% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they've had this horrific disaster. They're not responsible for it, but they've certainly felt the consequences.
Pema Gyamtsho, you said earlier in this discussion that certain areas, and I inferred from that areas that are downstream from some of these glaciers and these glacial basins, some of these areas perhaps just there shouldn't be more construction, maybe they shouldn't be inhabited. Do you think there are entire parts of Nepal right now in the Himalayas that should be evacuated?
Well, I think we cannot do that, and we cannot afford to do that. Also, it's not even possible to do that. But wherever possible, wherever feasible, I think that is the option that we should take. But it's a question of affordability. Now, what happens here doesn't stop here. What happens in the mountains with our glaciers, with our glacier lakes, doesn't stop there. It impacts all the way from the source to the sea, and the ripple effect will be felt across the globe. So we desperately need support. We desperately need financing to adapt and to build resilience of our communities. So this is an area that while we try our best to build regional cooperation, share information, share technologies, we need also support from the global community to address these challenges, to be better prepared next time.
Wolfgang Cramer, I'll ask you essentially the same question, precisely because you're on the other side of the world with very different extreme weather events, very different weather conditions. But from where you're standing, do you think, and I take no pleasure in asking this question, that there are entire regions of the world that perhaps should no longer be inhabited?
Yeah, we are asking that question in the scientific community ourselves. Does the habitability of the planet decline? And what we find is that a lot of the living conditions of people, as they are being degraded by the impacts of climate change, they still hit us differentially. In other words, if you are poor, if you are without possibility to live with air conditioning, for example, if you have no rescue services, then you are much more likely to be hit by the impacts of climate change than if you're a little bit more wealthy and you can protect yourself. From this follows, why I'm making this detour, from this follows that it is not such a question of entire regions to be uninhabitable or anything. It is more a question, for example, if you look at France or Spain, to protect the entire population, also the poor ones, also those who are not able to afford protective measures for themselves against, for example, the heat waves.
And that's all the time we have for today, but I do want to thank all our guests. Pema Gyamtsho, Benjamin Horton, and your earlier point about the frustration involved in repeating some of these things over and over again is well taken, and we appreciate you coming back on the program. Wolfgang Cramer, thank you also for being with us today. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Cyril Vanier, and the entire team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's news coverage continues in just a moment. Stay with us.